Today I'll be giving my official review to Final Fantasy XVI, released on June 22nd, 2023 for the PS5. The 16th of the 35-year-long running series is one that, like Nintendo themselves with their consoles, looks to continually innovate their games as they go along. Examples of this include removing experience points and leveling in its entirety when it moved from the first to the second entry. They went back to this for the third one. Changing battles from turn-based to the active time battle system from the third to the fourth entries, and moving into MMORPG territory for its 11th and 14th entries. Some die-hard Final Fantasy fans have taken issue that this newest entry is entirely action-based for its battle system. Being a fan of this series since the first entry, back when it was released in the US in 1990, I will say that I have no issues whatsoever with this move to an action-based game. In fact, the 15th and last entry was 100% action-based, more akin to a Kingdom Hearts game. I thoroughly enjoyed that entry, placing it within the bounds of my top 10 Final Fantasy games, as seen on the video I posted on this channel. With the 16th being more like a Devil May Cry, does it manage to improve upon what was done in previous entries? Does it manage to keep its roots of being a Final Fantasy game? Where does my entry fit on my overall list of top 10? Join me in my comprehensive review as I discuss this newest entry in my favorite series of all time, all while celebrating my 40th birthday. I did beat Final Fantasy XVI on my birthday, and yes, holy crap, I am that old. Regarding the overall gameplay, my buddy Runjin Run calls it basically Kingdom Come Deliverance plus Devil May Cry 5 with a Game of Thrones subplot. Such a statement really isn't surprising, as Final Fantasy XVI's combat director is Ryota Suzuki, who previously was a developer for Capcom for both Devil May Cry 4 and 5. He called the game his own personal masterpiece, referring of course to the battle system itself. 100% of the gameplay is done with the player controlling Clive Rosfield, the first son of the Archduke of Rosaria and shield to the second son, Joshua, heir to the throne and dominant to the Phoenix. More on the story later, along with appropriate spoiler warnings. Party members can join Clive as he progresses through his journey, though they will often continue on their own as the story progresses. This is very similar to how Final Fantasy IV was on the SNES, as the characters did the same on Cecil's journey. One large difference, of course, is that the AI completely controls these party members, and I've noticed they're not all that helpful to Clive within the bounds of battles, especially various bosses. This entry is fairly linear too. While we're not in the walking hallways of the 13th or even 10th entries, we're not given the wide-ranging freedom seen back on the 15th game. There are times where the player doesn't have to move the story along and instead can take side quests or hunts from the monster board. The side quests themselves are surprisingly dull and predictable. They're either fetch quests, rescue missions, or defeat the specific enemy requests. Towards the end of the game, they're often kill the horde of rampaging beasts to save the village. The main story sees Clive take an interest in the many locations and individuals he meets. The great thing about the side quests is that the overall story development for these individuals is actually pretty great. Hunts from the monster board are surprisingly underdeveloped though. This was something that was introduced back on Final Fantasy XII as the monster bounty system, and has appeared on every mainline Final Fantasy title since. This 12th entry had 45 total hunts, and even the abysmal 13th entry had 64, yet for some reason this newest and 16th entry only has 32. And while previous entries marked where these are on the map, the 16th one doesn't at all. At least until you find them, and they'll stay on the map if you unfortunately fall to one. And while we're talking about the map, I really wish the game had a mini-map on the screen. Previous entries since the 10th one had this, why omit it here? Animal instinct and guidance from Torgal, Clive's best boy and hound companion, is available, but this is no replacement for a map on the screen. For larger areas like Cid's Hideaway, I also wish there were fast travel spots within it that could be selected and moved to, like how Rabanastre is in the 12th entry. One of the devices this newest entry introduces is the active time lore system. When one of the cutscenes is occurring, or even during regular exploration during the main story, if the player holds down the trackpad button, it will bring up the system and give the player explanations regarding locations and or characters or terms being discussed. This is really handy, as new players diving into a brand new world can find out the who's and what's of everything that's going on. It can also be nice for those jumping back in from not having played for some time to relearn what is occurring. I also felt this ended up being kind of a catch-22 though. For example, characters in dialogue start talking about a person being Akashic, which is a term I had not heard before in the story, thus necessitating use of the active time lore system. In any other type of game or other storytelling vehicle, there'd be a character either playing dumb or not knowing what such a term would be, necessitating another character explaining it to both the uneducated character and player, or viewer. Active time lore allows the developers to tell their story without this as a crutch, thus being in better immersion since everyone in the world is in the know, but requiring those wanting to invest in the story a bit of extra work to do so, though conveniently provided by the game. My overall rating for the gameplay, again kind of excluding the battle system, would be an 8 out of 10. The game is very linear with small but boring deviations in the form of side quests. Further improvements can be made, but what we've got is still decent enough. So let's get into the crux of the matter, the battle system. As mentioned before, it is fully action-orientated. Battles are initiated either through continual exploration in the main quest or during side quests. Enemies in standard battles are already on the screen. Those random encounters continue to be a thing of the past for the series, and they rarely just appear out of thin air. A lot of these battles with enemies are pretty standard cannon fodder, often deftly disposed of with Clive's special abilities, or by knocking them down and executing a finisher. Even if the finisher fails to actually finish the enemy, Clive can just do a couple standard sword attacks and then initiate another finisher until the enemy's killed. Final Fantasy XVI follows one of the many tropes of an action RPG, in that when the player is in a dungeon and sees a big open area, it's almost a certainty that a boss will inevitably be fought there. There are also a few times where the player is given plentiful items like potions and high potions before one of these, and it's kind of reminiscent to my time with Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, whenever I got a bunch of health, armor, and ammo, signifying a big battle is coming up. Regarding the battles themselves, a number of staples to Final Fantasy games have been removed completely. There are no ailments like poison and dark whatsoever in the game. This effectively neuters the Marlboro enemies and their bad breath techniques. Elemental weaknesses kind of seem to be there, although the effectiveness of the attacks kind of were negligible to me. Most notably, elemental attacks that can be absorbed by enemies is also removed. This of course means that fire-based enemies can be hurt by fire attacks. MP or magic points are completely gone as well, with Clive being able to throw projectile-based magic whenever he'd like. Special abilities are learned by an ability tree system based on one of the 3 icons he has equipped. Icons, of course, are the summoned monsters, i.e. Espers, Eidolons, Primals, and so on. Because Clive fights with his sword with magical projectiles based on which icon he has equipped, there's no jobs system whatsoever. Icons have 4 abilities that can be learned, with only 2 of them being equipable. That means there's 6 total abilities at Clive's disposal, since 3 icons can be equipped at one time. Each ability has its own cooldown time, meaning it can't be used until that timer is up, with an audible tone alerting the player when a cooldown timer has ended. More powerful abilities, of course, tend to have longer cooldowns. Items can be used to recover health or buff Clive, while some of the cannon fodder have enemies that can buff or cure themselves. Clive cannot do this with his magic. There are only 7 consumable items that can be used, with 3 of them able to be assigned on an easy-to-use shortcut button. And being a game wanting to have a battle system steeped in real-time combat, Clive has a very limited amount of items he can carry at one time. Remember the days you could carry 99 potions and 99 high potions? Yeah, that was nice. Clive can only start out by holding 4 and 3 of each, respectively. These can be expanded with side quests, albeit only incrementally. And as bad as it sounds, I didn't know you could use items within the Start button menu itself. I thought they could only be used via the assigned shortcuts. One of my favorite YouTube content creators, MrMattyPlays, has called bosses spongy, what with how many hit points they have. I absolutely agree with him, and this is probably due to my not-so-favorite mechanic once again being implemented in a Final Fantasy game, stagger. Clive can damage enemies with his attacks, but larger enemies and bosses need to have their stagger bar depleted to allow Clive free chance to attack an enemy for extra damage without being attacked himself. The increased hit points and overall sponginess of these bosses could be a way to artificially inflate overall battle length. I've noticed also the spongiest enemies out in the field that have stagger bars often give horrible experience and ability points and often aren't worth the time to fight. Boss battles often feel like the sport volleyball. Serve, then recover, set, spike, recover, set, spike, recover, set, spike, and so on. Except in Final Fantasy XVI, it's attack, dodge, riposte, attack, dodge, riposte, attack, dodge, riposte. At least until the stagger bar is depleted so Clive can go all out on the enemy. One nice thing about boss battles in the main game is if the player dies, it'll respawn Clive with a full complement of potions and high potions, full hit points, and the boss health bar being depleted to close to where it was upon the player's death. This does not occur on quests or hunts not directly related to the main story, so beware. One big thing that was really featured during trailers and whatnot were the icon versus icon battles. These over-the-top kaiju-like battles actually ended up being a lot of fun to play once they got away from the first couple that felt like on-the-rails shooters. These often got to a hilariously epic scale, rivaling games like Ashura's Wrath or anime like Dragon Ball Super. Sometimes during these, as well as story-based boss battles, control would be wrested away from the player's hands into cinematics that often required QTEs, quick time entry, of one of 3 buttons. While QTEs is a very heavily used trope in action games, I did like that Final Fantasy XVI's were very forgiving, giving players many seconds to hit the correct button. Many of the enemies often used a lot of the attacks often seen in older Final Fantasy games, up to and including the final boss, firing away with the highest level magics like Meteor, Flare, and Holy. I loved seeing how these translated in a fully action-based game. I found myself having a lot more fun in battles overall than I thought I ever would have had. More than not, I was fully engrossed in many of the battles, leaning forward while Clive was attacking with his limit break, or wincing audibly whenever he got hit with a particularly vicious attack from an enemy. It should also be noted that while the game isn't particularly difficult, there is a story-focused, easier difficulty mode, as well as the standard action-focused normal difficulty. I played on the latter, which, while I admit I'm an older gamer, I was able to keep steady with all of the action almost the entire time, with having minimal deaths in the game. The battle system was by far my greatest worry for the game, and while the presentation of the game itself leans heavily more on cinematics and storytelling, the battle system itself was quite fun to play. Yeah, I've got my nitpicks, as you could hear, but overall, it was a ton of fun. Now, would I prefer a turn-based or active time battle system? Yes, I would. Do I still like the action-heavy mechanics for this entry? That's a yes as well. And overall, I'd give the battle system a 9 out of 10. For the overall graphical and technical aspects of the game, I do recommend checking out Digital Foundry's review on Final Fantasy XVI. For me personally, I had little if any issues in this aspect. There was barely any loading with the game, both loading from scratch and fast traveling in between areas, thanks in part to the SSD hard drive on the PS5. I was also thankfully not privy to the overheating issues that other PS5 users experienced while playing the game, and I didn't have any crashes at all during my entire playthrough. I did notice there were a few areas where Clive had to cram between a tight spot, which is a device used in games like these that hide loading of new areas. Thankfully, these weren't as plentiful as they were in Final Fantasy VII Remake. I also noticed the PS5 DualSense controller's haptics weren't used very much. Yeah, there were differing levels of rumble used, as well as some snap back whenever opening doors or riding a chocobo, but I felt like this was underutilized, or maybe it was used so subtly that I couldn't even tell. Either way, it wasn't as noticeable as it was like when I played Returnal on the PS5. The game offers 2 modes of presentation, quality and performance. Quality presents the game at 1440p scaled to 4K, and performance at 1080p scaled to 1440p. Quality always keeps gameplay at 30 FPS, while performance is supposed to at 60 FPS. I opted to immediately change to performance mode when I first started, but I did notice some constant frame rate dips. I then switched it to quality, immediately seeing the increase in graphic fidelity, while honestly the frame rate remained at a steady 30 FPS for me for nearly throughout my entire gameplay. And let me tell you, the graphics themselves are absolutely stunning. Hopefully you can see with the footage I presented here just how beautiful the game looks, with many environments being technical marvels for the PS5. My only complaint with the graphics has to do with a story event halfway through the game that gives many of the areas kind of a purple sepia-like tone, but besides that everything looks absolutely fantastic. The characters themselves just have that Final Fantasy look about them. I attribute that both to the director and producer of Final Fantasy XIV, Naoki Yoshida, who of course also produced Final Fantasy XVI. The overall way 16 looks is quite reminiscent to how character models looked during my playthrough of 14, albeit perhaps a bit more grounded. There are other similarities, such as how quests look in both games as well. While sometimes subtle, I was able to tell the difference between scenes where the character models are ones where they're pre-rendered FMVs, full motion videos. Besides crazy good special effects in the latter, character models are a lot more expressive. Still, even scenes with character models themselves do look quite well. My rating on the technical and graphical aspects are a 9 out of 10. The voice acting for the game is fantastic, with the VAs, voice actors, breathing both life and depth into all of the characters themselves. Besides Clive mostly sounding like Batman, I can't think of a single issue with any of the characters at all. There are a number of vocal performances that I noted came from other games, like young Joshua being voiced by the same actor in the same way as Hugo from A Plague's Tale. This isn't a bad thing at all, and after all, I'm used to noticing this, like how Ashley Birch sounds exactly the same in games like Life is Strange, The Last of Us 2, and Horizon Zero Dawn. If the voice fits and is acted well enough, I have no qualms about it. This is probably one of the most well-acted Final Fantasy games in the series. That's not to say the first few voice-acted games in the series, like Final Fantasy X, were bad. Context is key for awful scenes like the laughing one in that game. But I can just imagine Clive's VA, Ben Starr, yelling in anger as he seeks to avenge the death of his brother. This isn't a spoiler, by the way. This occurs the first couple hours of the game and also in the demo. Or even just feel the tenderness between him and Jill's VA, Susanna Fielding. While there are hours of cutscenes, the fantastic acting adds gravitas to the overall storytelling. One last thing about the acting, damn, there are a lot of F-bombs thrown around. Man, Square Enix really wanted to earn that M rating.
Fuck the dead king and his god. Fuck this withered shithole. Fuck! Fuck! Fuck!
Certainly illustrates the diversity of the word.
The overall sound, specifically with the sound effects, are fantastic. There are a few, like Torgal barking, that can play through the controller, though you may want to turn those off to preserve controller battery power. My only qualm with the overall sound was that I noticed the music itself being very quiet when I first started playing. I turned the voice and sound effects to 80, music to 100, and master volume to 100 in the overall settings so that I could enjoy the music. Adding to the overall familiarity for those who have played the 14th entry is the music itself, as Masayoshi Soken had composed the music for both entries. The battle and character themes are absolutely fantastic, marrying what is at stake when battling foes while also doing well to identify whom Clive is speaking to, respectively. The tracks for the Kaiju icon battles are especially epic in scale, matching and marrying the battles spectacularly. My only complaint regarding the music is that some of the music during standard field exploration is a little bit drab. There's no real theme that is melodic and catchy enough, like nearly all of the overworld themes for the first 9 entries. One of the best parts of the music is how it interplays common leitmotifs from the series as a whole through many of the scenes. We hear the mainstay prelude theme play in a slight minor key during the introduction of the game, as well as in later scenes throughout. The prologue theme is heard in this same type of minor when characters are interacting during an important conflict, although it is played in standard pitch once they are ready to move on to their next big objective. I loved that the beginning notes of the main boss theme play homage to Final Fantasy 1 through 6 and 9's battle themes beginnings as well. Overall, the audio gets a 10 out of 10. And check out what I mean here about the battle theme. One of the last aspects in this review I'll talk about is the story. It's similar to the level of political intrigue that was in the 12th entry with a little bit of Game of Thrones thrown in, but I feel that as the game progresses it sort of steps away from that into more grandiose JRPG type story tropes. The game itself takes place in an unnamed world on a continent called Valisthea, or the Twins, or Storm. Admittedly, I got confused by a number of names the characters kept calling the land they lived in. For clarification, Valisthea is the continent itself, the Twins are the two parts of the continent, east being Ash, and west being Storm. We see the world itself return to a high fantasy setting similar to that of Final Fantasy 1 through 5, 9, and especially 14. As mentioned before, we see the game through the eyes of Clive throughout a number of times in his life. Do note that from here on out, I'm going to be instituting a spoiler warning. Now, I'm not going to give a plot summary or anything detailing what exactly occurred within the parameters of the game, but instead I'll be talking about some general themes that I thought were interesting, but like many Final Fantasy games before, 16 is full of plot twists. Please move to the following timestamp shown here to avoid these spoilers. The story starts off with Clive as a 16-year-old sworn to protect his 10-year-old brother Joshua. Due to the Imperial Empire literally Trojan horsing Clive's Rosarian party, his father, the Archduke, is slain in front of Joshua, causing him to become his dominant form of Phoenix. This then results in Clive becoming a dominant that he didn't know he had, named Ifrit, who ultimately kills the Phoenix. Clive himself doesn't know he did the killing and instead blames a robed man who he got a vision of before he became Ifrit. Clive manages to survive, though is taken into slavery by the Empire at the behest of his mother, who, in a Game of Thrones twist, double-crossed her husband and kingdom to marry the Empire's emperor and bear him a son. In a Dragon Quest V-like time jump, though this one's of 13 years, we see Clive in this slavery state performing missions for the Empire. While on such a mission to destroy the dominant Shiva, he discovers this dominant is Jill, a former ward of Rosaria from the Northern Territories, and who became a close companion of Clive and Joshua when they were all growing up. Clive betrays the Empire, gets attacked by those who commanded Jill, and is rescued by Cid, whose dominant is Ramah. Cid ends up being a sort of role model and counselor for Clive and Jill, also instilling them with what ends up being their purpose for the rest of the game. And this is another really cool reference to past Final Fantasy games, as Ramah himself was a guide for the party in the 6th entry and for Princess Garnet in the 9th. And anyway, this purpose that Cid puts them on is to destroy the 5 mother crystals spread throughout Valisthea. The land is slowly decaying due to a phenomena called the Blight. This is resulting in animals and monsters migrating from blighted areas and mankind and their nations to fight one another for the remaining unblighted lands. And it's ironic to me that the goal is to destroy crystals, when in previous Final Fantasy games, heroes worked to preserve the integrity of the crystals, especially in the 5th entry. These mother crystals can splinter off as smaller pieces which provide creature comforts, allowing non-magic users to start fires, keep food cold, generate water, and the like. These creature comforts kind of reminded me of the Mako energy from Final Fantasy VII, with Cid getting Clive and Jill working to destroy the mother crystals, kind of like how Barrett's Avalanche did with the Mako reactors, due to Mako energy taking away the life stream from the planet and thus threatening it. Cid even says he's planning a visit to Mother, being another not-so-veiled reference to Final Fantasy VII, since Sephiroth of course said that about Jenova. Cid theorized the Mother Crystals were siphoning the energy called Aether from the planet, which is causing the Blight. Just like in the 7th entry, it begs the question of whether or not it's worth the crystals giving momentary comforts only to take more than they give, causing wars of attrition and slowly blighting the land. I'm guessing this is another allegory for oil and fossil fuels use in our world. During the course of the story, Clive comes to terms with the fact that it was he, in his dominant form, that slain his brother Joshua. He does this in an internal battle where he literally fights a semi-primed version of himself. Semi-primed is the form of a dominant using their elemental powers, but not becoming their animalistic form dominant in earnest. This literal battle of himself, both against himself as a man and as Ifrit, reminded me quite strongly of Cecil's and Kain's fight against their dark selves in Final Fantasy IV and IV After Years, respectively. Once all three of them defeat their own darkness, they become even more powerful versions of themselves. Continuing in the game, upon destroying the first Mother Crystal, Clive gets his first view of the god Ultima, an otherworldly being released from the crystal who aims to take control of Clive. And things get kind of wonky here. Clive gets knocked down, Cid sacrifices himself to save Clive from Ultima, and Ultima itself gets sealed by Joshua? How is he alive? The game sort of explains that a little bit later, but it kind of keeps that until the near end of the game. The game then fast forwards another 5 years, with Clive taking up Cid's name, treating it like a mantle, as he leads those that were at Cid's hideaway originally. That was destroyed by Titan in revenge for Clive destroying Benedicta, who held the dominant of Garuda. While the old hideaway was in blighted territory, the new one is in the shell of an airship. Which again, it's funny how it was Cid that noticed it in the first place. Because of nearly all of the past entries of Final Fantasy, Cid having some sort of relationship with airships. But it's from here that the rest of the story moves on, with Clive and his team destroying the Mother Crystals, Clive destroying the Dominants and their owners while absorbing their powers, and Ultima gaining more and more power still. And it turns out that destroying the Mother Crystals have been releasing Ultima's spirit, allowing them to be able to join together in hopes of taking over Clive, as he has been identified as Mythos. Mythos has the ability to receive Ultima and cast a spell called Raise, which can ultimately reset the planet, totally getting rid of humanity in its entirety. As Mother Crystals fall and Ultima gains strength, all the nations and their leadership fall as well, both by direct assassinations or just by indirect means, such as swarms of monsters and Akashic individually destroying towns. Or by the crazy kaiju battles that Clive and his combatants are having. Seriously, just the havoc they have on the planet is nuts. So really the game morphs from a political type schema into a literal man versus God trope. Except the god looks and sounds like the Borg from Star Trek. It is revealed that Ultima himself, itself, created man but then slumbered, leaving man to toil and suffer. Eventually, though, thanks to the strong will and consciousness that the man has, they endured and gained strength themselves. It's this will that is impeding Ultima from fully taking over both the world and Clive. I felt the theme then morphed into the power of choice made possible by our own will, and the question of, do we take the path that is right or the path that is easiest? All of the human enemies Clive has fought had chosen the latter in the game, with Clive consistently making the right choice, knowing it'll often be the harder one, up to and including the literal end of the game. I feel like the idea of having free will being a power in unto itself also reminded me a lot of the Jim Butcher book series called The Dresden Files, in that many of the supernatural beings there don't have free will, at least not to the extent as regular humans, or those that wield magic. The end of the game sees Clive being able to successfully destroy Ultima, thanks to the sacrifices of others, including his brother Joshua. Using the powers he siphons off of Ultima, he destroys the crystal at Origin, a location raised by Ultima once the 5 Mother Crystals were destroyed. Doing so also destroys all traces of magic in the world, but it also results in the death of Clive. This was kind of a cool nod to Final Fantasy VI's end as well, because that end also saw the end of magic and of all of the magical creatures called Espers. Regarding Clive's final fate, it is contested whether or not he really died at the end. I'm of the camp that he did die at the end, as that's how these Final Fantasy games have gone, usually. Examples of this include Titus defeating Yevon, knowing it would be the end of the faith and of himself in the 10th entry, Fran and Balthier staying behind to let the party escape the dreadnought Bahamut in the 12th entry, Fang and Vanille becoming part of the crystalline structure connecting Grand Pulse and Cocoon, saving Ladder from destruction in the 13th. Noctis sacrificing himself to stop his overall line from the Star Scourge, bringing a new dawn in the 15th entry. Going back to 16, we're treated to a new dawn of a greater era at an unspecified time after the events of the game, shown after the end credits. We see a woman who sort of looks like Jill with two boys who kind of look like Clive and Joshua in a beautiful meadow and in a small cabin. Unable to cast magic to start fire, but you see the boys playing pretend using some of the nomenclature that had occurred in Clive's story. And that's because the game ends on the book Final Fantasy, written by Clive Rossfield. Overall, the storytelling and the story itself, along with the character development, was great. Themes were fantastic and well developed and really made me think, and it really had that formulaic Final Fantasy fare. Yes, there was quite a bit of cutscenes for the story to be shown, but thankfully they were all pretty enthralling enough to keep me interested. I'd rate the story as a 9 out of 10. As I've mentioned during the course of my review here, there's a whole host of allusions and Easter eggs to previous entries in the Final Fantasy series. While the number of references don't rival what was shown in, like, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, they were still plentiful. Here's some cool ones that I noticed during my playthrough. The airship hull that is Clive's hideaway is revealed to be named the Invincible. This is the name of the dreadnought-sized airship the party has in Final Fantasy III and Garland's airship in Final Fantasy IX. There are several black mage-looking scarecrows in the agricultural fields that appear. The Mageth brothers' mark is actually a play on the Magus sisters, who are a boss in Final Fantasy IV and a summon in Final Fantasy X. The names for these are even Sandwid, which is Sandy, Sindwid, Cindy, and Midwid, Mindy. In the carved-in stone quest, Clive must recite words on a tablet to an old man. One of the options that Clive can select, which is wrong, mentions the machines making a snowy trek, a clear reference to the Magitech armor machines in the beginning of Final Fantasy VI. The character Mid herself is a reference to one that appears in Final Fantasy V. While 16's Mid is female and 5's is male, they both have blonde hair and an affinity for invention and ships. The ship she builds is named the Enterprise, which shares the name of the ship in Final Fantasy I and the airship in Final Fantasy IV. At one point in the story, Clive believes using his dominance power burns a part of himself away. This feels like an allusion to Final Fantasy VIII's Guardian Forces, as the more those are used, the more memories of the user's past are burned away too. In the Lines in the Sand side quest, when Clive approaches the bandits' camp, they identify him as the guy that killed their friends, Locke and Fingers. The former's name is a reference to one of the main characters, the treasure hunter Locke in Final Fantasy VI. Many of the monsters in the game appear and behave much as they would in previous entries, none more so than the Behemoth and King Behemoth in 16. This is up to and including casting Meteor like the monster does in Final Fantasy V and later entries, as well as performing the attack Maelstrom. This latter attack is dangerous as it leaves Clive with single-digit hit points, just like the Behemoths did in Final Fantasy IV. The first Ifrit form of Ultima Prime at the end of the game has one black wing going off to the left of its body, and this is a clear reference to Saphir Sephiroth's one-winged angel form in Final Fantasy VII. My time with Final Fantasy XVI was one that I enjoyed a lot more than I thought I would. Do I believe it should be Game of the Year? No, that title will go to Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and deservedly so. Regardless, the 16th entry of this storied franchise is one that shouldn't be missed if you like the series overall and are willing to play an action-oriented version of the game. The game graphically is absolutely beautiful, the story pretty formulaic, but it's good, characters are extremely engaging, and music is phenomenal. Overall, I am giving Final Fantasy XVI a 9 out of 10. But where does Final Fantasy XVI fit on my overall top 10 for the series? I genuinely believe that it is better than the 15th entry, even though a lot of the freedom and autonomy from this entry was lost in favor of more linearity of storytelling's sake in 16. I had the 15th entry at number 6. 16 takes that spot now, pushing all other entries before it back a number. While 16's story and character development is a bit stronger than 12's, I did prefer the latter's battle system, hunts, super bosses, environments, and job system. But 12, in my opinion, is a 9.5 out of 10 game, with my numbers 1 through 4 being clear 10 out of 10s. I also wonder what's next for Final Fantasy XVI as a whole. I know Sony has the exclusivity agreement with Square Enix, keeping the game on the PS5 for a year or more. I'm sure it'll make its way to PC at some point. YouTube content creator Dreamcast Guy mentioned that there could be some demand for a demake-like version into a 2D pixelated adventure. Essentially, they could make it a pixel remaster version of Final Fantasy IV, but focusing on Clive and giving better party control to the player when characters like Cid join. There's history of Square Enix doing this too. Look at the 2D version of Dragon Quest XI that was added when the game's S version was released. I could also see DLC being added to the game, exploring one of the major dominants missing, being referred to as the Lost Leviathan. The idea of this summon being lost is nothing new for the series. Leviathan was missing in its entirety in the original version of Final Fantasy VI, and whose origins were shrouded in mystery in Final Fantasy IX. Regardless, there's still potential for this single entry in the future, and that much more so for the series as a whole. Whether or not Final Fantasy XVII goes back to its pixelated or turn-based roots, I'll definitely be picking that up as well, as 16 has proven to be a quality title. Now, have you played Final Fantasy XVI at all? Do you plan to now or not, based on my extensive review here? Let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you all and continue discussions on this and where you see the future of the Final Fantasy series going. While I am an older gamer who's been playing for decades, as you can hopefully tell, I tend to be fairly open about change in general and like to be able to try new things for older series. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining me here and sticking around for me during this long review. And while you're at it, please remember to like or dislike this video, subscribe for more content, and ring that bell for notifications. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.
Even if it meant standing against the very gods in the heavens.
I shall be borrowing this, Father, if I may, that you might watch over us as we follow in your footsteps.
We won't lay you down.